In the gilded penthouses of Northgate City, where wealth insulates and power corrupts, some secrets are kept locked behind soundproof walls and brilliant smiles. This is the story of Lily and Brendan Connolly, the city's golden couple. He was the heir to a real estate empire. She was the beautiful, kind-hearted woman carrying his child. To the world, their life was a fairy tale. But fairy tales can be the most convincing lies. This isn't just a story of domestic tragedy. It's the story of what happens when the system fails, when a father's love turns into cold, calculating vengeance, a revenge so meticulous and devastating it would bring an empire to its knees and leave an entire city in stunned silence. Northgate City adored the Connollys. They were a dynasty carved from concrete and steel, their name emblazoned on the city's most prestigious skyscrapers. Vincent Connolly was the patriarch, a titan of industry, with a wolf's smile and eyes that missed nothing. His son Brendan was the heir apparent, impossibly handsome, devastatingly charming, and seemingly devoted to his wife, Lily Peterson. Lily was the city's darling. The daughter of Robert Peterson, a self-made logistics magnate, she possessed a quiet grace that stood in stark contrast to the Connollys' aggressive ambition. Robert had built his company from a single truck into a national powerhouse, and he had poured all the love a father could give into his only daughter. When Lily met Brendan at a charity gala, Robert had his reservations. Brendan was too polished, his smile too practiced. But Lily was smitten, and seeing her happy was the only thing that mattered to him. Their wedding was the event of the year, a spectacle of wealth and influence. For 2 years, their life, as portrayed on social media and in society pages, was perfect. They lived in a sprawling penthouse overlooking Centennial Park, a glass palace where the city lights twinkled below like a carpet of fallen stars. When Lily announced her pregnancy, the city celebrated with them. The Connolly heir was on its way. But inside the glass palace, the air was growing thin. Brendan's charm was a mask he wore for the public. At home, it peeled away to reveal a man consumed by a need for control. It started subtly. He'd critique her choice of dress, suggesting something more befitting a Connolly. He'd casually dismiss her friends as unsophisticated, slowly isolating her from her support system. He took over her finances, claiming it was easier for him to manage their complex portfolio, leaving her with a generous allowance, but stripping her of her independence. "Don't worry your pretty little head about it, darling," he'd say, tapping her cheek. "That's what you have me for." Lily, ever the optimist, tried to see it as his way of caring for her. But the criticisms grew sharper, the control tighter. He would grab her wrist a little too hard during an argument, his fingers leaving faint marks she'd cover with a sleeve. He'd back her into a corner, his voice a low growl, his face inches from hers, until she would shrink back and apologize for whatever imaginary slight had set him off. Her father, Robert, saw the shadows under her eyes during their weekly lunches. He noticed the way she flinched when a waiter dropped a tray, the way her laughter never quite reached her eyes anymore. "Is everything all right, sweetheart?" he asked one afternoon, his voice gentle but firm. "He's treating you well." "Of course," Dad Lily replied, forcing a bright smile. "Brendan is wonderful, just a little stressed with the new development project. And pregnancy hormones are no joke." Robert didn't believe her. He knew his daughter. He saw the flicker of fear she tried so hard to hide. But he also knew pushing her would only drive her further away, further into Brendan's grasp. He had to wait for her to come to him. He prayed she would soon. The last time he saw her conscious was at the Connolly Foundation's annual benefit. Lily was 7 months pregnant, radiant in a flowing emerald gown. She stayed close to Brendan's side all night, her hand resting on her swollen belly. Robert watched from across the ballroom as Brendan leaned in and whispered something in her ear. The brilliant smile on Lily's face faltered for a second, replaced by a look of pure dread before she quickly composed herself. Later that night, Robert saw them leaving. Brendan's hand was clamped firmly on her upper arm, his knuckles white. 2 days later, at 3:17 a.m., Robert's phone rang. It was Northgate General Hospital. The voice on the other end was calm, clinical. "Mr. Peterson, there's been an accident involving your daughter Lily Connolly. She had a fall. You should come to the hospital immediately." The words didn't register at first. A fall Lily was always so careful. Robert threw on his clothes, his heart hammering against his ribs. He sped through the sleeping city, the red lights blurring into streaks of blood against the dark canvas of the night. He burst into the emergency room, his mind a chaotic storm of fear. He found Brendan in the waiting area, his head in his hands. His expensive suit was rumpled, but his face was a mask of practiced grief. "Robert!" he choked out, rising to his feet. "Thank God you're here. It's terrible. Just terrible. What happened, Brendan?" Robert demanded, his voice raw. "Where is she? She must have slipped." Brendan stammered, his eyes darting around. "We were arguing. Stupid things, you know how it is." She got upset and ran towards the stairs. The grand staircase. I heard a scream, and then a thud. There was so much blood, Robert. A doctor approached them, then his face grim. "Mr. Peterson, I'm Dr. Matthews. Your daughter has suffered severe head trauma from the fall. We've had to perform an emergency C-section to save the baby. Your grandson is in the NICU. He's stable for now." Robert felt the world tilt on its axis. A grandson. He couldn't even process it. And Lily? What about Lily? The doctor's expression hardened with pity. "Her brain activity is minimal. We've done all we can. She's fallen into a coma. At this point, we don't know if she will ever wake up." Robert's legs gave out. Brendan rushed to steady him, putting a hand on his shoulder. "We have to be strong, Robert. For Lily. For the baby." But as Robert looked at his son-in-law, the man who was supposed to protect his daughter, he saw something in his eyes that wasn't grief. It wasn't panic. It was the cold, flat glint of relief. And in that moment, a seed of suspicion, dark and poisonous, took root in Robert Peterson's soul. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that this was no accident. The days that followed were a waking nightmare. Robert divided his time between 2 hospital rooms. In the neonatal intensive care unit, he stood over a tiny incubator, watching the fragile, rhythmic rise and fall of his grandson's chest. The nurses said the baby, whom they had temporarily named John Doe, was a fighter. Robert looked at the tiny, perfect hands clenched into fists and saw his daughter. He saw her strength. Then he would walk down the sterile, silent hallway to the ICU to Lily's room. She lay utterly still, a porcelain doll broken by a careless hand. A web of tubes and wires connected her to machines that breathed and beat for her. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor was a constant mocking reminder of the life that flickered just out of reach. Brendan was often there playing the part of the grieving husband perfectly. He'd hold Lily's limp hand, whisper loving words and shed tears for the benefit of the nurses. The police had ruled the incident a tragic accident. Detective Kowalski, a weary, overworked cop with 2 decades on the force, had taken Brendan's statement. "He seems devastated," Mr. Peterson Kowalski told Robert. "There's no evidence to suggest anything other than what he said." She was emotional. She slipped. It's a tragedy. Robert's gut screamed otherwise. He knew Brendan was lying. But he had no proof, only a father's intuition and the cold look he'd seen in his son-in-law's eyes. 2 weeks after the fall, Robert and Lily's best friend Sophie went to the penthouse to pack a bag of Lily's things, hoping familiar scents might stir something in her unconscious mind. The grand staircase, a sweeping curve of marble and polished oak, loomed over the entrance hall. Robert felt a wave of nausea as he imagined his daughter tumbling down its unforgiving steps. The police had already cleaned the scene, but in his mind he could still see the blood. While Brendan was at a business meeting, a transparent attempt to maintain normalcy and control the narrative, they moved through the silent apartment. The place felt cold, sterile, less like a home and more like a showroom. In the walk-in closet, a space larger than Robert's first apartment, surrounded by designer clothes and rows of expensive shoes, Sophie began to cry softly. She wasn't happy here, Robert. She whispered, clutching a silk blouse to her face. She tried to hide it, but I knew. He was always putting her down, controlling her. She called me a few weeks ago crying. She said she was scared. She made me promise not to tell you. She didn't want to worry you. Robert's heart clenched. Why didn't you tell me, Sophie? I should have, she sobbed. But she made me swear. She said she had a plan. She was saving money. She was going to leave him after the baby was born. Saving money. Brendan controlled everything. How could she be saving money? It was then that Robert noticed it. Tucked away on the top shelf behind a row of hat boxes was a simple, nondescript shoebox. It was out of place amongst the designer labels. He pulled it down. It was heavy. Inside, nestled among some old photographs, was a thick, leather-bound journal, and beneath it, wads of cash totaling nearly $10,000, and a burner phone. His hands shaking, Robert opened the journal. The first few pages were filled with Lily's familiar, bubbly script detailing her excitement about the pregnancy. But as the pages turned, the tone grew darker, the handwriting more frantic. October 12th. Brendan was angry again tonight. I bought the wrong brand of sparkling water. He said it was typical of me, careless and thoughtless. He didn't yell. It was worse. He just looked at me with such disappointment, like I was a stupid child. He told me I was lucky he was patient enough to put up with me. I spent the rest of the night apologizing. November 5th. He threw a glass against the wall tonight, right by my head, because I was on the phone with Sophie for too long. He said my friends were a bad influence. He smashed the phone on the ground. The sound of the glass shattering. I felt it in my bones. He was calm afterward. He cleaned it up and then came to me, holding me, telling me he just loves me so much and can't stand the thought of anyone taking me away from him. My heart was still pounding. Is this love? It feels like being trapped. December 21st. He pushed me. For the first time, he actually pushed me. I stumbled back and hit the edge of the kitchen counter. A massive bruise is already forming on my hip. I cried, and he immediately started crying too, begging for forgiveness. He said the pressure of his father and the baby was getting to him. He promised it would never happen again. I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to believe him so badly. Robert had to sit down, the journal falling from his trembling hands. He felt a rage so pure and so potent it threatened to consume him. This wasn't a series of arguments. This was systematic abuse. This was torture. He had failed to protect her. He had let his little girl walk into a monster's den and had done nothing. He picked up the journal and kept reading each entry a nail in Brendan's coffin. The final entry was dated the night of the fall. January 16th. He found the money. I don't know how. He found the box. He's calling me a liar, a thief. He says I was planning on stealing his son. His son? Not our son. He's downstairs, drinking. I can hear him pacing. I'm locked in the study. I'm so scared. He keeps telling me through the door that we need to talk this out. But I know what that means. I see the way he's looking at me now, at my belly. He sees the baby as another possession. I have to get out. I have to protect my baby. I'm going to wait for him to pass out, and then I'm going to run. I'll call Dad from the road. Dad will know what to do. He always does. But she never made the call. Robert closed the journal, a single tear of fury tracing a path down his cheek. The grief in his heart was hardening, crystallizing into something cold, sharp, and unbreakable. He now had Lily's voice, her truth written in ink. He had the proof. He looked at Sophie, her face pale with shock and horror. "The police need to see this," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes," Robert said, his own voice, sounding foreign to his ears, devoid of all emotion. "They do." He put the journal, the cash, and the burner phone into his briefcase. He walked over to the grand staircase and looked down. He saw it all now. Brendan finding the box, the confrontation. Not an argument, but an interrogation. Lily trying to escape. Brendan grabbing her at the top of these stairs. He didn't just let her fall. He threw her. Robert was sure of it. He left the penthouse with a resolve of forged steel. He would not just see Brendan pay for what he'd done. He would make him and the entire Connolly empire that protected him burn to the ground. The time for grief was over. The time for war had begun. Armed with Lily's journal, Robert Peterson walked into the 17th precinct, feeling a sliver of hope. The truth, he believed, was a powerful weapon. He met with Detective Kowalski again, laying the journal on the detective's cluttered desk and watching as the man's expression shifted from weary skepticism to genuine concern as he read excerpts. This changes things, Mr. Peterson, Kowalski admitted, rubbing his tired eyes. This establishes a pattern of abuse. It gives us motive. I'll reopen the case immediately. We'll bring him in for questioning. For a brief moment, Robert allowed himself to believe in the system. He imagined Brendan in an interrogation room, his smug composure finally cracking under the weight of Lily's words. He imagined justice. But Robert had built his empire in the real world, a world where justice was not a right, but a commodity. And the Connollys could afford to buy it in bulk. The day after Robert's visit to the precinct, the Connolly machine roared to life. Vincent Connolly, a man who moved through the city's corridors of power like a shark, made a few phone calls. His first was to the police commissioner, a man he played golf with every other Sunday. His second was to the city's most formidable defense attorney, a legal pit bull named Mitchell Vance. His third was to a public relations firm that specialized in crisis management. When Detective Kowalski went to his captain to get the warrant for Brendan's arrest, he was told to stand down. "We're not moving on this, Stan," his captain said, refusing to meet his eyes. The DA's office looked at the journal. "They say it's hearsay. Inadmissible. A pregnant woman's hormonal writings." Their words, not mine. "Hormonal writings," Kowalski sputtered. "So the woman has a fractured skull and is in a coma. The journal describes escalating physical violence. It describes one push," Stan, the captain, countered, his tone final. "The rest is emotional. It's a he said, she said, and she can't say anything. Brendan Connolly has a dozen witnesses who will testify he worshipped his wife. It's a tragic accident. Let it go." Kowalski was furious, but he was a soldier in a war where the generals had already surrendered. He called Robert, the shame and frustration evident in his voice. "I'm sorry, Mr. Peterson. My hands are tied. The powers that be, they've shut it down." Robert felt a cold dread seep into his bones. He had underestimated them. He had underestimated the depth of their influence. The next phase of the Connolly counter-offensive was public. The PR firm went to work. Sympathetic stories began appearing in the Northgate Chronicle. They painted Brendan as a tragic, heartbroken figure, watching over his beloved wife day and night. They quoted friends of the couple who spoke of their idyllic marriage. Anonymous sources began whispering to gossip columnists, suggesting Lily had been emotionally unstable during her pregnancy, prone to dramatic episodes. They were poisoning the well, turning his daughter into the architect of her own demise. Then came the lawyers. Robert received a letter from Mitchell Vance's firm. It was a cease and desist order, warning him against making defamatory statements about Brendan Connolly. It was a threat wrapped in legalese. They were silencing him. The final, most brutal blow came from Vincent Connolly himself. He requested a meeting with Robert, a civilized conversation between two fathers. They met in a private room at an exclusive downtown club, the air thick with the smell of old leather and older money. Vincent was a portrait of composed power. He offered condolences that sounded like insults. He spoke of the terrible tragic accident and the need for the family to heal together. Robert Vincent said, stirring his drink slowly, "I understand your grief, but you are letting it cloud your judgment. You are making things difficult. For Brendan. For yourself. For that little boy in the hospital." Robert's eyes narrowed. "Is that a threat, Vincent?" "It's an observation," Vincent replied smoothly. "You have a logistics company, don't you? A fine company, but one that relies heavily on city contracts, zoning permits, port authority regulations. It would be a shame if unforeseen complications were to arise. A business as complex as yours, it needs to run smoothly." The message was crystal clear. "Back off, or I will destroy everything you've built." Robert sat back the ice in his own glass, untouched. He looked at the man across the table, a man who was not protecting a grieving son, but a guilty one. A man who would use his immense power not to seek truth, but to bury it. In that moment, Robert understood. The law, the press, the police, they were all just tools in the Connolly toolbox instruments to be used to maintain their power and protect their own. The system wasn't just broken, it was owned. He stood up his chair, scraping against the polished floor. He looked Vincent Connolly directly in the eye, his gaze as hard and cold as granite. "Thank you for the drink, Vincent," he said, his voice level. "And for the clarity." He walked out of the club and into the cold night air. The city lights, once a symbol of opportunity and ambition, now seemed menacing, a web of corruption with the Connollys at its center. He had tried to play by the rules. He had presented the truth, and the truth had been thrown back in his face. They had built a wall around Brendan, a fortress of money, lies, and influence. Fine. Robert Peterson knew a thing or two about building things, and he knew even more about demolition. If he couldn't get through their wall, he would simply bring the whole damned fortress crashing down around them. He would no longer seek justice. He would exact revenge. Robert Peterson's grief did not disappear. It transmuted. It cooled and hardened, changing from a raging fire into a block of black ice in the center of his soul. He was no longer just a grieving father. He was an architect, and the blueprint he was designing was for the complete and utter destruction of the House of Connolly. He began by changing his life. He sold his company, Peterson Logistics, to a national competitor for a price that was fair, but fast. His board of directors was stunned. Robert had built the company with his bare hands. It was his legacy. But Robert knew his old life was over. His only legacy now was the silent woman in the hospital bed and the tiny baby fighting for his life in an incubator. The sale gave him two things he now valued above all else: liquidity and anonymity. He was no longer a public CEO, a man with vulnerabilities and city contracts. He was just a very, very wealthy man with a singular, all-consuming purpose. He moved out of his family home, the house where he'd raised Lily, filled with too many ghosts. He took a nondescript apartment in a different part of the city, under a new corporate lease. He channeled a significant portion of his fortune into a series of untraceable shell corporations and offshore accounts, a web of financial entities so complex it would take a team of forensic accountants years to unravel. He was erasing Robert Peterson the businessman and becoming a ghost. His days took on a new, grim rhythm. Mornings were for the hospital. He would sit with Lily, reading to her, talking to her, telling her he was handling things. Then he would visit his grandson, who the nurses had started calling Noah at Robert's request. Holding Noah's tiny hand through the incubator porthole was the only thing that kept the ice in his soul from freezing him completely. His afternoons and nights were for the war. He converted a spare bedroom in his new apartment into a command center. The walls were covered in corkboards, connecting photographs of the Connolly family, their business associates, and their political allies, with a spiderweb of colored yarn. He wasn't a spy or a detective, but he had spent 40 years in the cutthroat world of business. He knew that every empire, no matter how powerful, has cracks in its foundation. His job was to find them and insert the dynamite. He began with Brendan. He hired a team of discreet private investigators, former Mossad and MI6 agents, sourced through a high-end security consultant. He didn't want dirt. He wanted leverage. He wanted Brendan's entire life mapped out, every meeting, every transaction, every secret. The information started to trickle in, then flood. Brendan's public image as a devoted husband was a sham. He had a revolving door of mistresses, usually models or aspiring actresses, whom he would set up in luxury apartments owned by Connolly Holdings. He had a severe gambling problem, losing hundreds of thousands of dollars on high-stakes poker games and offshore sports betting sites. Most damningly, he had a violent streak that was an open secret in certain circles. The investigators found 2 former girlfriends who had signed lucrative non-disclosure agreements after accidents that had resulted in trips to the emergency room. But Robert knew that exposing affairs and gambling debts would only tarnish Brendan's reputation. It wouldn't destroy him. He needed to go deeper. He needed to attack the source of their power, their money. Robert's focus shifted to Connolly Holdings. He knew a company of that size, run by a man as arrogant as Vincent, had to be cutting corners. He began digging, using his new wealth to hire forensic accountants and data security experts. They started with the company's public filings and worked their way inward. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One of Robert's investigators identified a man named Frank Miller, a senior project manager at Connolly Holdings, who had recently been passed over for a promotion in favor of Vincent's less qualified nephew. Frank was disgruntled deeply in debt from a messy divorce and knew where the bodies were buried. Robert arranged a meeting. He didn't threaten or cajole Frank. He appealed to his conscience and his wallet. He set up a trust fund for Frank's children, enough to put them through college and beyond accessible only when the job was done. Vincent and his son think they're gods. Robert said, his voice a low, compelling murmur. They believe they're above the law. They hurt people, Frank. They hurt my daughter. I'm not asking you to lie. I'm just asking you to help me show the world the truth. Frank, seeing a way out of his financial prison and a chance to stick it to the family that had used him up and cast him aside, agreed. He became Robert's inside man. Over the next few months, Frank fed Robert a steady stream of information via encrypted hard drives delivered through dead drops. The picture that emerged was one of staggering systemic fraud. Connolly Holdings had a signature method. They would acquire land for major development projects, often using political leverage to get it rezoned. They would then create dozens of shell subcontracting companies, all secretly owned by them. They would award these companies massively inflated contracts for materials and labor, effectively paying themselves with the investors' and banks' money. They were building $500 million skyscrapers for a fraction of the cost and pocketing the difference. It was money laundering on an epic scale, a scheme so audacious and complex that no one had ever thought to look for it. Robert now had everything he needed. He had the details of Brendan's depravity and the evidence of Vincent's colossal fraud. He held the matches and the gasoline. But he wouldn't strike wildly. This was not about a quick, satisfying explosion. This was about a slow, controlled demolition. He would take them apart piece by piece, ensuring they were fully conscious as their world crumbled around them. He would start with the son, the prince of the city, and then he would move on to the king. The first phase of his revenge was about to begin. Robert understood that in a city like Northgate, perception was reality. The Connollys' greatest shield was their public image, the powerful, respectable dynasty, the philanthropists, the city builders. Before he could touch their finances, he first had to shatter their reputation. He had to make the public question the fairy tale. His first target was the carefully crafted image of Brendan the grieving husband. Among the files from his private investigators was a detailed report on Brendan's primary mistress, a stunning but volatile actress named Kira. Brendan had set her up in a condo at the Elysian Tower, one of his own buildings. The report included photographs, security footage of him entering and leaving her building, and even transcripts of text messages where he complained about Lily's moods during her pregnancy. The most valuable piece of intel, however, was that Brendan was still seeing her. Even with his wife in a coma, he was sneaking away for late-night trysts. Robert decided not to use a mainstream newspaper. They could be bought or intimidated by Connolly's lawyers. Instead, he chose a popular, notoriously sharp-tongued online gossip blogger named Dana Winters, who ran a site called Northgate Confidential. Dana had a reputation for printing the stories the big papers were too scared to touch, and she had a massive, loyal following. Through an encrypted email account and using a voice modulator for a phone call, Robert's team contacted Dana, presenting themselves as a concerned friend of Kira's. They didn't just give her the information, they curated it. They built a narrative. They provided a timeline photos of Brendan entering Kira's building just last week, and a few carefully selected, scandalous text messages. They gave her an undeniable explosive story. 2 days later, the headline on Northgate Confidential sent a shockwave through the city's elite, comatose wife, clandestine lover, Brendan Connolly's bedside. Vigil a sham. The article was a masterpiece of righteous scandal. It detailed the affair, complete with photos and quotes from an anonymous source who claimed Brendan had called his marriage a business arrangement. It painted a picture of a heartless philanderer who was more concerned with his illicit rendezvous than his comatose pregnant wife. The fallout was immediate and spectacular. The story was picked up by every news outlet in the city. Reporters began camping outside the hospital, the Connolly Holdings headquarters, and the Elysian Tower. The public narrative shifted overnight. Brendan was no longer the tragic husband. He was a villain. Talk show hosts and online forums lit up with condemnation. How could a man whose wife was fighting for her life, whose newborn son was in the NICU, be so monstrous? Vincent Connolly's PR team went into overdrive, issuing statements, calling the story a baseless and disgusting fabrication, and threatening to sue Dana Winters into oblivion. But Dana, protected by the anonymity of her source, and the undeniable proof of the photos refused to back down. She posted a follow-up piece with even more evidence. The damage was done. The first crack had appeared in the Connollys' flawless mirror. For the first time, the public was looking at them, not with admiration, but with suspicion. Brendan, unaccustomed to public scorn, did not handle the pressure well. He was photographed yelling at a reporter, his handsome face twisted into an ugly sneer. The mask was slipping. For Robert, this was just the overture. While the city was distracted by the sex scandal, he was preparing his main assault. He knew that taking down their reputation was one thing, taking down their empire was another. The financial crimes Frank Miller had uncovered were the key. But going to the local authorities was pointless, as he'd learned. The Connollys owned them. He had to go bigger. He and his team of forensic accountants spent weeks compiling the data Frank had provided into an airtight, undeniable dossier. They created flow charts tracing the money from investor funds through the labyrinth of shell companies and into offshore accounts controlled by Vincent and Brendan. They cross-referenced fake invoices with real project timelines, proving that the Connollys were billing for work that was never done and materials that were never purchased. They even included satellite imagery of construction sites, showing a discrepancy between the reported progress and the reality on the ground. When it was complete, the dossier was a monument to corporate greed, hundreds of pages of evidence detailing a fraud that ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars. Robert packaged the information into 3 identical encrypted drives. He didn't send them to one agency. He sent them to 3 simultaneously, ensuring they couldn't be buried by a single compromised official. One went to the Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, in Washington, D.C. One went to the IRS's Criminal Investigation Division. And the third, the masterstroke, went to a tenacious, Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist at the Wall Street Journal, known for taking down corporate giants. He sent the packages from a post office in a different state using a fake identity. There was no return address, just a simple typewritten note included with each drive. The Connolly family has been stealing from this city for 20 years. Here is the proof. Do what is right. Then Robert waited. He had laid the mines. He had set the charges. And he knew it was only a matter of time before the entire corrupt edifice of Connolly Holdings was blown sky high. The public humiliation of their son was just the appetizer. The main course was about to be served. For 3 weeks there was silence. The scandal over Brendan's affair began to fade, replaced by other, newer headlines. Brendan, emboldened, started to re-emerge, attending a board meeting and being seen at a quiet restaurant. It seemed as though the Connolly machine had weathered the storm. Vincent Connolly was confident he had contained the damage. They had always been untouchable. They had no idea that federal investigators from 2 different agencies and one of the nation's top journalists were quietly and meticulously corroborating the information from the anonymous tip. They were subpoenaing bank records, interviewing shell company directors, and building a case so massive and irrefutable that it was completely leak-proof. They were coordinating. The storm broke on a crisp Tuesday morning. At precisely 9:00 a.m., a fleet of black SUVs descended on the Connolly Tower in downtown Northgate. Dozens of federal agents from the FBI, working in conjunction with the SEC and IRS, poured into the lobby their blue jackets, a stark contrast to the building's opulent marble. They presented a warrant, secured the building, and began the systematic raid of Connolly Holdings' executive floors. Employees were told to step away from their computers as agents began seizing servers, boxing up documents, and questioning stunned executives. Simultaneously, a separate team of agents arrived at the Connolly family estate in the city's most affluent suburb. They swarmed the property, their presence a shocking intrusion into the manicured insular world of the super-rich. The city's financial district froze. News helicopters buzzed overhead, broadcasting the shocking images to the world. On the Wall Street Journal's website, the bombshell story dropped with the headline, "Titans of Fraud Investigation Reveals Vast Criminal Enterprise at Heart of Connolly Holdings." The article was a devastating, detailed exposé of the entire scheme Frank Miller had revealed to Robert. It laid out the shell companies, the inflated contracts, the money laundering, all supported by leaked internal documents. It implicated Vincent and Brendan as the masterminds. The city was in shock. The Connollys weren't just city builders, they were thieves on a grand scale. The pension funds that had invested in their projects, the banks that had loaned them billions, the city itself, they had all been victims. Brendan was at his penthouse when he saw the news on television. His face went white. His phone began ringing incessantly, but he just stared at the screen, watching images of federal agents carrying boxes out of his father's office. He was trapped. There was nowhere to run. Vincent Connolly was in a board meeting when his assistant burst in her face, ashen. He was arrested on the spot, the titan of industry, led from his own building. In handcuffs, his face a mask of disbelief and impotent rage. The photographer's flashes were like lightning strikes, capturing the fall of a god. For Robert, watching the news from his anonymous apartment, there was no joy. There was no triumph. There was only the grim, chilling satisfaction of a promise fulfilled. He had told Vincent he'd given him clarity. This was that clarity. This was the consequence. But his plan wasn't finished. There was one final piece. The financial crimes would put them in prison for decades. But Robert needed Brendan to face judgment for what he did to Lily. With the Connollys' power completely shattered, their political influence evaporated overnight. The police commissioner and the district attorney who had previously protected Brendan were now facing federal scrutiny for their connections to the Connollys. They were desperate to distance themselves, to prove they weren't on Vincent's payroll. Suddenly, Detective Kowalski found his hands untied. He received a call from the DA's office. "That Coma case involving Brendan Connolly, the prosecutor said. Reopen it, immediately. Find me something we can use." Kowalski didn't need to be told twice. He now had the leverage he needed. He began by re-interviewing everyone, starting with the two former girlfriends of Brendan who had signed NDAs. With the threat of the Connolly legal team gone, and with the offer of immunity from the DA, their stories came pouring out. They described a pattern of terrifying rage, of physical abuse, of being choked, pushed, and threatened. They had medical records and photos they had kept hidden away. The pattern of abuse was now firmly established and corroborated. Lily's journal was no longer the ramblings of a hormonal woman. It was the final tragic testimony of a victim in a long line of them. Kowalski went to the hospital to see Lily. Robert was there holding her hand. The detective looked at the still pale woman on the bed, and then at the fierce, grieving father beside her. Mr. Peterson, Kowalski said, his voice filled with a new respect. "We have everything we need. We're issuing the warrant for Brendan Connolly's arrest, for the assault of your daughter." The second wave of justice was about to crash down on Brendan. His financial world was in ashes. Now his personal one was about to be set ablaze. The walls of the fortress had fallen, and the monster inside was finally completely exposed. Brendan Connolly was a king in a cage of his own making. The penthouse, once his symbol of dominance over the city skyline, had become his tomb. For 2 days, he'd been marinating in a toxic brew of expensive whiskey and impotent fury, the television a constant flickering tormentor. Every channel broadcast the spectacular implosion of his life, images of his father, the indomitable Vincent Connolly, looking frail and defeated in an orange jumpsuit. Financial analysts dissecting the colossal fraud with clinical precision, and his own face plastered everywhere, the philandering, abusive monster. His world had shrunk to the dimensions of this glass box, the city lights below no longer a sparkling kingdom, but a sea of accusatory eyes. He was a ghost, haunting the ruins of his own life. The call from his last remaining lawyer was the final nail in the coffin. They have a warrant, Brendan. For aggravated assault. The old girlfriends. They're talking to the DA. They have photos records. They're coming for you. Now, the line went dead, and a profound animalistic panic seized him. It was a terror he'd never known, the absolute certainty of a predator, suddenly finding itself prey. His mind, a tangled mess of narcissism and delusion, could not process his own culpability. It had to be someone else's fault. An enemy. An architect. And in the wreckage of his thoughts, one name stood out like a shard of black glass: Robert Peterson. The old man. The quiet, self-made man he had always dismissed as provincial, as beneath him. It was all a quiet, methodical act of war. The affair leak, the anonymous tip to the feds, the sudden courage of his past victims. It all traced back to the father, whose daughter he had broken. Fueled by a final desperate surge of rage, Brendan found Robert's number. He had to hear it. He had to force the old man to admit what he had done. Miles away, the air in the neonatal intensive care unit was warm and filled with the gentle rhythmic hum of life-sustaining machines. Robert Peterson sat in a rocking chair, his grandson Noah cradled against his chest. The baby, once so fragile, was now a tangible weight of hope in his arms. He had his father's dark hair, but Lily's peaceful expression in sleep. In this sterile, quiet world, Robert had found a semblance of peace, a purpose beyond vengeance. The simple grounding act of caring for this tiny life was the only thing that kept the icy resolve in his soul from consuming him entirely. His phone vibrated, a harsh intrusion from the outside world he had so deliberately shut out. A blocked number. He knew with a chilling certainty who it was. Gently placing Noah back in his bassinet, Robert stepped into the quiet antiseptic hallway and answered. Brendan's voice snarled across the line, a venomous rasp, ragged with whiskey and hate. You did this. You snake. You ruined me. Robert stood perfectly still, the phone cool against his ear. He felt no surprise, no jolt of adrenaline, only a profound, weary finality. I did nothing, Brendan, he replied, his voice unnervingly calm, a frozen lake in the dead of winter. I simply held up a mirror. It was your own reflection that destroyed you. You and your father. My wife is in a coma because of you. Brendan screamed, his voice cracking the delusion absolute. You got in her head. You turned her against me. A flicker of the old white-hot rage flared in Robert's chest, but he compressed it instantly, turning it into something harder, colder. Your wife is in a coma because you are a coward who preys on the people who love you. Robert stated each word a precisely aimed dart. She is in a coma because you threw her down a flight of stairs like a piece of trash. I know everything. Her journal told me. Every threat you whispered, every slap you delivered in the dark, every single moment she lived in fear of the monster she shared a bed with. A choked, ragged gasp came from the other end of the line. Brendan was silent, the bluster and rage momentarily shattered by the raw, undeniable truth. I built a business, an entire life, with my own two hands. Brendan Robert continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying the crushing weight of an avalanche. It was an honest life. And you, Connollys, with your inherited power and bottomless arrogance, you tried to threaten that. You threatened me. You thought your money made you invincible, a god in your glass tower. But my love for my daughter, that is a force you could never and will never comprehend. I saw what you took from her. Not just her health, but her light, her laughter. I decided then that I didn't want your money. I wanted to take your world. I wanted to peel back the layers of your life until there was nothing left but the small, pathetic creature you are. Your name, your freedom, your future. I wanted you to feel what it's like to have everything you care about turn to ash in your hands. I wanted you to be alone in the dark, just like you left her. Through the phone, a new sound echoed a heavy, insistent pounding. The police had arrived at the penthouse door. Brendan let out a choked, defeated sob, the sound of a hollow man finally breaking the last of his narcissistic armor, crumbling to dust. "They're here," he whispered, his voice that of a lost child. I know Robert said, devoid of pity or triumph. "Face what you've done." He ended the call and stood for a long moment in the silent hospital corridor, the phone heavy in his hand. He was not a hero. He was not a vigilante. He was simply a father who had kept a promise. He had walked through hell, and he had dragged his daughter's tormentor down with him. The trials were a media spectacle that Robert completely ignored. The news ran endless loops of Brendan being led away, his face pale and tear-streaked, the final ignominious image of a fallen prince. He and his father were convicted on all counts. Vincent would die in a federal prison. Brendan, after the judge read Lily's harrowing journal entries into the court record, was sentenced to consecutive maximum terms. His name became a byword for monstrous evil in Northgate City. The Connolly Empire was history. Robert's war was over, but his vigil had just begun. He sold his large family home and moved into a comfortable apartment near the hospital. The fortune he had amassed was now channeled into a new foundation in Lily's name, a powerful resource for shelters and legal aid for victims of domestic abuse. He had used his power to destroy. Now he would use it to build. His days settled into a quiet monastic routine. Morning in the NICU with Noah, afternoons by Lily's bedside. He read her favorite books to her, the words filling the silent, sterile room. He told her about her son, about his first smile, about the way he gripped his finger. He updated her on the foundation, telling her how her strength was now helping hundreds of other women. He talked to her not as if she were gone, but as if she were just resting, gathering her strength. Months blurred into a season of quiet devotion. The city moved on, but Robert's world remained centered on that one hospital room. One cool autumn afternoon, almost a year after the fall, he sat by her bed, holding her hand, as he always did. It was a familiar limp weight in his own. He was telling her a story about Noah's fascination with the colored mobile above his crib when he felt it. A flicker. A tiny, almost imperceptible pressure against his palm. His breath hitched. He froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. Did I imagine that? For months he had prayed, hoped, bargained with a god he wasn't sure he believed in anymore. Maybe his desperate mind was finally playing tricks on him. He stared at their joined hands, barely daring to breathe. And then it happened again. A distinct, deliberate squeeze from her index finger. A raw, guttural sound escaped his throat. Tears, hot and blinding, welled in his eyes, the first tears not of rage or grief, but of impossible, shattering hope. "Lily," he whispered, his voice, trembling, breaking on her name. "Lily, sweetheart, can you hear me?" He watched her face, his entire being focused on her. Her eyelids, which had been still for so long, began to flutter. It was the faintest of movements. But to Robert it was a seismic event. Slowly, miraculously, as if pulling a tremendous weight, they opened. Her eyes, the same brilliant green he knew so well, were unfocused, clouded with the fog of a long twilight. But they were open. They were seeing. A single, perfect tear escaped the corner of her eye and traced a slow path down her temple into her hair. Robert brought her hand to his lips, his own tears falling freely now, washing away the ice that had encased his heart for so long. The road ahead would be immense, a mountain of therapy and uncertainty. Recovery was a hope, not a promise. But in that moment, none of it mattered. The man who had meticulously orchestrated the ruin of an empire to avenge his daughter felt the first true glimmer of a new dawn. He had walked through the darkest valley of hatred, all for the love of his child. And now, holding her hand with her son sleeping peacefully just down the hall, he finally saw it, a chance to leave the wreckage behind and build a future. The story of Robert Peterson is a stark reminder of the terrifying places love and grief can take us. It's a story about the failure of a system designed to protect the innocent and the terrifying lengths one man will go to when that system sides with the powerful. We saw a father's love curdle into a cold, calculated plan for revenge, a plan that not only brought a monster to justice, but dismantled a corrupt dynasty in the process. Was he a hero, a vigilante, or just a father who refused to be silenced? His actions shocked a city, but they started a conversation that we need to keep having about hidden abuse and the corrupting influence of power. What do you think were Robert's actions justified? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, please hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and make sure you subscribe to our channel for more true life stories that matter. Thank you for listening.